Our prayer, as we again concentrate on the presence of God within us, might be an extension of what we just prayed in the chapel. So again, let us have recourse to the founder to help us concentrate on the presence of God within us this morning. Should I not be constantly moved to think of you, my God, considering that you are always with me and in me, and that I can do nothing of myself? All my thoughts and acts should remind me of your presence and bring me closer to you. The very beatings of my heart are so many warnings, calling me to give you all that I have and all that I am. Inspire my mind with these sentiments and move my heart in like manner, so that the mind may think only of you and the heart occupy itself only with your love. Say John Baptist, Lasallian.
Pray for us.
Live Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
Could I call your attention to the reading list for a moment? And there are two things to say about the readings that are listed for tomorrow. The first is that they are very extensive, 150 pages again. And the second thing is, if you'll notice, I can't find the damn things. Yes, there we are. We go out of sequence a little bit in the blank. Under number 12, so for tomorrow, you have to finish all of book 2 and the first 12 pages of book 3, the third volume, the third book that you have. And then, after page 12, you jump to page 40 to 45. Pages 13 to 49 cover the Rouen thing, but I think it's better to skip that for the moment to keep things in sequence in Paris, to get our work for tomorrow really is to look at the founder in the face of these major obstacles and controversies, first those set up by the diocese and the cardinal and the pastor, and then those set up by the writing masters and the schoolmasters. So we have those two big fundamental conflicts with the establishment. Now, to be honest with you, I really regret the fact that the schedule's been changed. So from my point of view, it would have been much better if we were to have this the session as scheduled on Friday, because it would give you more time to read this stuff carefully. Matter of fact, I suppose I wouldn't be altogether opposed to going back to the original schedule for this group, but I guess there wouldn't be too much sentiment for that, would there? But that puts a pretty heavy burden on you for this afternoon and this evening to read through all of that, and it's kind of complicated. But it is terribly, terribly important. And so do what you can with it, and we'll try and see if we can address all of that tomorrow. And that will leave next week for us to deal with Rouen, the expansion, and the final years of the founder in the 3 sessions left to us for next week. And I really hope today to be able to get as far as the readings would bring us, and that is to the establishment at Avignon in 1702. So we'll turn the corner from the 17th to the 18th century, I hope, this morning. Okay, so there's just a few things that we really, in a sense, have finished this, but founder comes to Paris in 1688. We had all that business with the school. We have a new pastor. Now, this is another thing to keep track of these pastors of St. Sulpice. First, it was de la Barmondiere who brought him there. And even though de la Barmondiere, of all of the pastors of St. Sulpice, looks like kind of on the founder's side, it's very interesting that he falls hook, line, and sinker for all of those calumnies that were set up against the founder by Compagnon. And through the pious ladies and all that. And it was really cool to De La Salle and practically was ready to let him go. Now, this is a theme that runs through the founder's life. So much of his life And his work was centered in this parish of Saint-Sulpice. So the whole question of the relationship of the founder and the Sulpicians, I think, is a very interesting theme to look at, and especially the conflict with these pastors. But if you remember what we said about the way the thing was structured, the really full control of the charity schools in each parish was in the hands of the pastor. So the founder was very dependent on the pastors on the one hand, and on the other hand, he wanted to be independent of them, and especially in what concerned the manner of running the schools and the internal life of the community of brothers. And so this was a kind of a tightrope that he had to walk all the time. And the pastors were really, well, pastor rhymes with another word that's not very flattering. And I think most of them were more entitled to the word that begins with a B than the one that begins with a P. But anyway, so even of them all, Della Barmondiere, who brings them there, I guess comes off the best. But here's Baudrin, who starts off anyway by being a spiritual director, and I think he dumps him, as a matter of fact. There's some evidence of that for Boine when he goes to Vaugirard. But, and here's Baudrin, who's supposed to, and Blanc, of course, since Blanc, these are his teachers from Saint-Sulpice, and Blanc is always saying how wonderful they all are, and then he proceeds to tell us how terrible they are treating the founder. And so Blanc is contradictory on this score, too. But then when we come to Baudrin, Baudrin is giving the poor old founder a hard time right from the word go, beginning with the business on the habit. And then he opposes the novitiate, and he tries to move their house and their community, and then when the famine comes, he's not even willing to pay them their salary. And then he gives them advances and winds up by charging them for it. So and when we come to, we'll meet de la Chétardie this morning too, before we're finished, and he will become a major figure tomorrow, as we shall see. So and Chétardie remains the pastor from 1696 all the way to 1714, and it's probably maybe a factor in the founder's decision to return. But that's all. I'm getting like Blanc. That's all ahead of us. But I'm just suggesting that in the keeping the structure of this whole, or the sequence of these events in your own head, don't lose track of the relationships with the pastors of Saint-Sulpice. It's an extremely important element in the development of the Institute and in the response to the founder. Okay? All right, so with that in mind, we get the first conflict, the beginnings of the trouble with the schoolmasters in the Rue de Bac. And eventually the founder wins that case, probably through the intervention of some very influential people. And but if we look at page 80, 81, 82, and 83, Blanc's apologetic for this. Now, of course, this is interesting because this argument is still with us, isn't it? Or this discussion. What do we mean by the preferential option for the poor? What do we mean by the service of the poor? What do we mean by the direct and the indirect service and all that? Now, there's not much reference here to the indirect service, but Blanc, I think, is very contradictory in some of the things that he's trying to say. He starts off by saying, because in this context, the discussion is a legal one. Every pastor, as we have said over and over again, had the responsibility for the charity schools in his diocese. But it was understood that the charity schools were only for the poor and for the certified poor. So Blanc has paragraph after paragraph saying, oh, the kids at the Brothers' School were surely poor. The schoolmasters had no right to be interfering with this because they were charging people, and these are people who couldn't pay. There weren't any others still there. They were all poor. They were really poor. Then he has to admit, well, there were some who weren't poor. There were some who could afford to pay, etc., etc. And, but how do you know? Maybe they're really poor. Even some people who can afford to pay, maybe they really can't afford it. And isn't it embarrassing for them to have to be to admit that they're poor? And so who wants to say that they're poor? And so on and so forth. And so we find it winds up at the end of the thing with kind of pragmatic arguments and so on and so forth. So, and then he finally says, well, somehow or other, the founder is right and everybody else is wrong. Of course, the other thing is the motives he imputes to the schoolmasters. All they're interested in is their money, you know. and so on and so forth. Well, rightfully, in the Rue de Bac, all of a sudden, here's this school open, and it's a better school than anything the schoolmaster is running, who has the title to that territory, and all of a sudden his best students are running over to the brother school, and they're getting a better education, and the parents are happy with it, and so on and so forth, and that word begins to get around. Of course, that was their livelihood. You can hardly blame them for an intrusion onto something that was fundamental to their own livelihood. But so Bland will come back to this question again and again and again as it arises. And it's one that the founder has to continually deal with. But he insisted on the absolute gratuity of the schools, absolute gratuity all the time, independently of the ability of the students or their parents to pay. Anybody want to say anything about that? So for example, Blant here talks about the poor as the destitute. Now, Poutet makes it very, very clear that the destitute were not coming to our schools. Where does he get that business about the destitute? Is it on 83? Oh, yes. Yeah. Now, it should be kept in mind that the vocabulary of the poor were a real recognized social class made up of people who were actually destitute. Many of them had no fixed abode, they had no trade, so on and so forth. They lived largely by their wits. And Poutet would not agree with that at all. Poutet says that the really, really destitute, the vagabonds and so on, were either in the poorhouse or not in a stable parish and so on. So that's he makes the point that the poor, in the founder's terms, tied in with the artisans, were those whose income was unstable. They were never sure from day to day and week to week that they would have enough to support themselves. And so they were from families where the father had to work, the mother had to work, the kids had to leave school and go to work at an early age, and so on and so forth. They were not the absolute downtrodden desperates, and so on and so forth. So Poutet certainly would disagree with Hernandez's footnote down at the bottom. That's Hernandez. Whereas Poutet has a very different thing. And then Blant has this explanation of going back and forth all the time. So you really have three different points of view right here on this page of who are the poor. Okay? Yes?
Were the writing masters and the schoolmasters the same group?
No, I explained that way in the beginning.
Yeah.
We had that already.
But I'm just trying
Just to refresh. The schoolmasters were those who were running an individual school all by themselves, a one-man schoolroom, or maybe with an assistant. The writing masters were a guild. The schoolmasters of a skilled guild of professional scribes. The writing masters were protected by the king. The schoolmasters were under the supervision of the diocesan supervisor, known as the écolateur. Okay? And keep that in mind. We'll make that very clear tomorrow when we look at the controversy. And they were at odds with each other, because the writing masters didn't want the schoolmasters teaching writing. Okay to teach reading, but not writing. But they finally gang up together against De La Salle's. Anything else on that? Then it's interesting that here right away in 1690, 2 years after he's into Paris, and he brings two brothers with him, probably hand-picked to start this enterprise in the capital, and two of them leave. And one of a very good teacher, the other one hangs on a little bit longer and gets very insulting towards the founder, apparently even threatens to strike him or actually strike him. I can't tell from what Bland says whether he actually swung back at the founder or something like that. In all of the fact that the founder imported somebody else to be the superior in the house. Bland doesn't say it, but it occurs to me that probably the person that the founder brought to Paris to be the superior was Henri Leroux, the one that the brothers in Reims had elected to be a successor and assumed the superiorship briefly until the diocese got wind of it back in Reims. Because, as we'll see, Henri Leroux is in Paris when he dies, and apparently he had covered by this time enough theology. If the founder started studying theology in Reims, he might have had enough to satisfy for ordination by the time 1690 comes along, and so the founder brings him to Paris to finish that up and prepare for his ordination. So I strongly suspect that the superior that the others resented so much was this kind of, this big shot, man who for a time had been the superior of the society. And now he's their director all of a sudden, and they're not too happy with that. Okay?
If you wouldn't mind going back just a little bit to 77.
All right.
Where you mentioned in the beginning, the place talks about
Compagnon,
and Villa
Barmondier.
and how he accepted all the accusations about the charitable lady in particular. Bland says, we do not know what the malicious accusation actually was.
Yeah.
That's misleading and goes on. Do you have any suspicions or comments?
My suspicion is it might have had something to do with corporal punishment. And that whole fracas that Bland relates earlier with regard to Reams, which seems to be a little dislocated, might have been part of the problem here when you grant what the situation was in the school that they had to try to correct. It's a guess. Gus, have you any? Yeah.
With regards to the women in the parish.
Yeah, it's the women, he gets the women all up in arms at this thing, and so that's the sort of thing that might appeal to some of the leading hearts.
Wouldn't corporal punishment have been quite popular there at that time?
Yes, I suppose it was, but the founder was willing to allow it to be used when he thought it was necessary after everything else failed.
And why would these be up in North again?
Well, maybe because in this parish it hadn't been used. It's pretty evident that they had no control over those kids. And how extensive it was, or whether that was considered appropriate, is something else. Every time I talk about Monsieur de la Barmondière, I have to hesitate when I try to say it. Way back when I was a scholastic one time, we had reading during the meals. We were reading Battersby's Life of the Founder, and I was reading this story. And it was during World War II, and I referred to it without even thinking as Monsieur de la Bombardier. Andy O'Connor almost swallowed his meal whole. He let out an enormous yelp. Woo! And then it took me a little while to realize what the problem was. So we got Gabe, you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking, I thought maybe the women lost the authority and prestige with the founder coming there, because he probably kept the women at a distance from the brothers, and their influence was minimized by his being there. It probably was Champagnon had a lot of power before. So I just figured if I was a typical woman's guild or something, they would have retaliated this way.
I don't think they had much influence in running the place, though, but they were contributing. Of course, they had been contributing to the support of this thing when Champagnon was running it. So he had long been their benefactor, and so it would be easy for him to get their ear. But I don't think it had much to do with any control that they had over the policies or anything like that. That they'll say, here I've been doing this wonderful work all these years, and this character comes along and he's messing everything up. But as Blanc says, he had to have some rather specific charges to convince them and then to get the ear of the pastor. Although we shouldn't forget that these pastors had a very, very extensive parish that was the size of a diocese to administer. And so there's always two sides to these questions. The other side of it is, of course, is that they were happy with the brothers, but they didn't like De La Salle because I think that, again, like Letellier and Reams, they wanted this to be a parish society. They didn't want, we'll see more of that as we go along. Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down in it. So that takes care of where we were supposed to be at the end of yesterday. Okay, now let's take a look at this situation in Paris over this more or less 10-year period, the last decade of the 17th century. So here we are, the founder has had great hopes for the significance of moving to Paris, and after only 3 years, he's in real deep trouble. And so I think it's not an exaggeration to call this the crisis of 1691. We are exactly 300 years later after this year, so it's an appropriate year to be focusing on the crisis of 1691. Now, the first thing is his own illness. First of all, in Reims, after that long trip when he's exhausted and his grandmother comes to see him and he refuses to allow her upstairs, and she apparently was a little upset over that. But he comes downstairs and calms her down and says it's not that bad. He goes back to Paris, and then he gets terribly sick again, and this time it becomes very, very serious, and Blount indicates what the illness was, that he was unable to urinate. Now that's common enough, usually in older men, as some of us around here already know, and they did not have the remedies in those days, or the easily and relatively simple remedies that we have today for that type of a problem. But so they call in this Dutch doctor, whose name was Helvetius, who had earlier taken care of Louis Tronson, so the Sulpicians probably dragged him in. Baudrin maybe had something to do with calling him in. And so he proposed a remedy. Now, it's not clear to me what the remedy is. It sounds sometimes as if Blount is thinking some sort of a purgative or something taken internally that would release this blockage. Or it may have been an invasion from the outside, which you can imagine would be rather painful in those primitive circumstances before anything like anesthesia had been developed or any of that sort of thing. But at any rate, he warns the founder of the seriousness of the remedies about to apply and the chances that he probably might not survive. Old Baudrin probably was not too unhappy with this development. For all the pious stuff that's going on here, he gets all the priests of the parish and has a big, long, solemn administration of the sacrament of extreme unction, as it was then called, and a big dramatic scene with the brothers all around asking the founder for his blessing, and somebody has to hold up his hand and all that, and he was always reluctant to give his blessing anyhow, and so on. So he receives viaticum, and the founder was always fussy about the requirement that when priests are involved in the reception of sacraments, they always wear the surplice in the stole. So here he is. Somehow they got those vestments on him, received viaticum, and then the doctor went to work. Whatever he did, and stayed with him, and apparently the remedy was successful, and the founder recovered. But again, here was an event. Now at this point, he's only 40 years old. And he has to begin to think, well, you know, he's not going to live forever. And he came awfully, awfully close to going to his eternal reward. So that created some reason for thinking. Then all of a sudden he gets news of what's going on in Reims. He had left behind 16 brothers in charge of another brother, Henri, not Henri Leroux, but another brother, Henry, who was, again, young, inexperienced, very rigid and very tough on the brothers. And so 8 of the 16 left, and only 1 or 2 new ones had come in. So here the institute is cut in half already, down to 8 brothers in that center in Reims. And of course, then meanwhile also, the junior is drying up, and candidates aren't coming to that, and the school for country schoolmasters. Now, of course, Blount attributes all this to the devil. The reason why the school for the training teacher of the country schoolmasters folded up was that after 1 or 2 years, it's something like the Buttimer, you run out of a clientele. All of these pastors got their school teachers back, and so every pastor had now a trained school teacher from De La Salle, so there weren't any more to send. This happened to our theology program in Manhattan, and I suppose eventually it will happen to the Buttimer. After a while, everybody will have made it. Let's hope. From what I hear at the moment, anyway, the plan is to run another Buttimer one next year and announce that it will be the very last way of doing it in this format. So it's not too surprising that the country schoolmasters thing collapsed. But the whole situation back in Reims is falling apart. Then, of course, the biggest blow of all is when the founder is up in Reims after he recovers. Here's old Henri Leroux, and he's up in Reims, and he hears that he's sick. Well, he thinks, oh, he's a strong man, not to get too excited. Then another message coming and saying he's very, very sick, and it's crucial. And then the founder realizes that he'd better get back there. When he gets back to Paris, he finds that poor old Henri Leroux has already been dead and buried by a couple of days. So all of a sudden it looks like everything's collapsing around him. He's had a warning in what happened to his own health and his near death. The situation in Reims is deteriorating rapidly, and his major, the keystone of his plan to have a brother replace him and to have a brother ordained to replace him so that there won't be the problem of an ecclesiastical superior and so on with the higher authority. Oh, all of a sudden, all of the principal elements of his plan are falling apart and collapsing. And then in the middle of all of this, his grandmother dies, the one that he was very fond of, and the one that supported him most of all, Perrette l'Espagnole, the mother of his mother. So this situation is a real crisis. And then meanwhile, of course, he's having all of these troubles back in the parish with the pastor, who's trying to get a strong hold on the Institute and who's opposing all of De La Salle's own plans for the direction in which he thinks God wants the Institute to go. So it is a real crisis. So as Bland puts it, he decides that the more he looks around, he begins to think about, why are we losing so many brothers? Some through death and some through loss of their vocation. Well, he figures that's because they weren't given enough training, and that's because we don't have a place where when they get sick, where they can recover their health. So the first thing he sees is the need for a place, a center, whereby that could serve as a training center and a place that could also serve as a place of rest and repose and recuperation for those who are sick. And really, it's a two-point plan. Find a place that would remedy those things. And the other part of the plan, of course, was to provide for a succession. So he looks around and he tries to make judgments about the men available, and he finally settles on Gabriel Drolin and Nicolas Guillard to get the three of them together to say, this thing is falling apart. We've got to put it back together again. So let's together see what we can do with this. So, yes?
Just a matter of dating. In the beginning, they give 1690 as their year for all this happening.
Yes, well, don't go too strongly by the chronology in beginnings. Arose himself has revised a good bit of that, all right? And that was the best thing that was available back in 1980 when I did it, but I think that I'm surprised, to tell you the truth, that 1690 is the date there for all of that. Some of it, of course, was in 1690. In 1690, that's when the controversy with the schoolmasters and the memoir of the habit and all.
This is his illness and
His
going
illness.
back to the reading.
Yeah.
That should be 691, though.
Oh, well, the illness. The 90 might be the right date for the illness. I just can't be sure offhand. Gus, can you help me on this?
I think what you're saying is correct. There's a period going through from the middle of 1690 into the middle of 1691.
Yeah, that, I think, it crosses that year. That's a good way to get out of the difficulty, I guess, yeah. And the illness is nowhere, it's not dated anyway, so that has to be some kind of a guess. Except in terms of going backwards, that would, by the time he gets to Vaugirard, and then by that time he would have had to have recovered, etc., so probably the illness would be 1690. But the crisis, if we put this all under the crisis of 1691, it's all building up, as a crisis does, so I guess that's the way to explain it. All right. So the first thing is to get the place, and so he has this. But in no way does Baudrin want him to have set up a novitiate, a training center. Why? Well, it would first of all it would get him out of the center of the parish. It would give him an opportunity to begin to look like the founder of a religious congregation that would not be dependent on the pastor of the parish. So Baudrin was looking after his own interests. He was perfectly happy to have the brothers and even De La Salle with them to have the best school in town there in the Rue Princesse, and the other one on the Rue de Bac. But then all of a sudden to have this founder begin to think about, well, locating way the hell out of town, a center where he would be in total control all by himself, away from the pastor, away from the control of the parish, and set up an independent operation that he would not have total control of. It's easy to understand his objection. And of course, so the founder, of course, Blair is great. Here's the humorous thing on the part of Baudrin. The founder is macerating himself and trying to bargain with God and all that sort of stuff. And Baudrin says he can beat himself to death if he wants to, but he's not going to change my mind. Huh? So what does the founder do? Very interestingly, he's enough of a shrewd ecclesiastical politician. He goes over the pastor's head to the Archbishop de Harlay, and he gets the Archbishop's okay to set up this training center, or novitiate, if you want to call it that. I think Blount is anticipating canonical categories. So he gets the Archbishop's approval to set up this center. And so he gets around it that way, which could not have made the pastor very happy either. Huh? When that's done in ecclesiastical circles, you may win the battle, but you often lose the war. Last night, when we were talking about all that business of the scourging and the beatings and the disciplines and all that sort of stuff, it occurred to me, and I think this is kind of a theological language that we've developed recently, is that not only says something about the spirituality of the times, of course it does, but when we think of spirituality, we're thinking of the spiritual practices that people have. But it also says something about the theology of the time. And that really is, this implies a certain view of God. And even a certain view, Gus and I were talking about this the other day, of what redemption means. The notion that you can bargain with God, and the best bargaining chip you have is suffering. Huh? That if the more you suffer, huh? That this is what God demands. You see this every once in a while. Huh? And so God demands the sacrifice of Henri Leroux, for example. And he interprets it because the founder's life was saved, so God wants somebody else as a victim. Huh? There's a lot of that. That occurs in the life of Miguel, by the way, one time. The Blessed Sacrament was profaned in one of the schools where they were, and the director of the house, God held him responsible, and he died the next week. God was getting even for that. So there's a theology here. Huh? What kind of a God is your God? Well, it's the older approaches to the theology of redemption, that because of all of these terrible sins, somebody had to make up for it with all the suffering. Huh? So Jesus is up on the cross and he says, I've been here an hour. Is that enough? Heavenly Father? The Heavenly Father says, no, stay there another hour. Is that enough now? No, so make it 3 hours. And by the way, goodbye. I'm going to abandon you. Why will you abandon me? That type of quid pro quo sort of thing, and bargaining with God and trying to buy things from God by, well, it's a theology as well as a spirituality that's involved here. I think you ought to keep that in mind. So what kind of a God are we involved in? Which still leaves, of course, the whole problem of suffering self-inflicted, suffering that we have to inevitably accept, and the suffering that's built into human existence, which is another theological consideration, and another consideration for spirituality too. But we can't get too deep into the theology thing, but that occurred to me as a way of reflecting about what's going on here every time the founder feels that he has to use this means to win from God what he wants, and Blount's way of interpreting it is that. Okay, so that's so now this whole thing is in process, and we are at Vaugirard. Now, so Vaugirard, it's interesting to see what's going on at Vaugirard. The first thing, of course, at Vaugirard is the priority was, now he gets there, and as soon as vacation time comes in September, the priority was to get all of those brothers who had no formation whatsoever, most of them now had been in the schools for a while, to bring them there for a retreat during the vacation time. So in a certain sense, this was a renewal program, or in some of our modern terminology, a second novitiate. He has a second novitiate before he had a first novitiate. He had a juniorate before he had anything, so he starts with the juniorate, then he has a second novitiate, and he finally gets around to a novitiate. So that was the first thing. So he brings all these brothers in during vacation time, the whole Reims crowd and the Paris crowd. There's 2 centers. And the thing is going so well, but as Blanc says, the 10 days were barely enough to whet their appetites and to get them to see, or maybe to get the founder to see, what it was they really needed. So he arranged to have lay substitutes in the schools in Reims, and using some of those country schoolmasters to somehow keep the schools going, and so he kept them there for another couple of months. All right? And he finally became convinced of the necessity that they really be given an intensive period of spiritual formation, and perhaps even some bit of academic formation too, about especially motivation for what they were doing in the schools. So, and from then on, he begins to see the necessity for bringing them together regularly for this. And the founder keeps every chance he gets, he restores this practice of bringing all the community brothers, all of those in the Paris area, as you read. They finally had to come, once they went back to school, they had to come back to Vaugirard on weekends and during holiday times. So they pile right out of school and hoof it up to the novitiate and get right into the swing of the novitiate routine and live with the novices and under de La Salle's direction. And that went on for a couple of years. And the ones in Reims who couldn't get down there on weekends and so on, well, then he'd bring them all down at vacation time. He set up a similar program when his final novitiate gets settled in Rouen. So then he begins to develop, once that program is settled, in November, he gets hold of Vuillard and Rollin, and the three of them, in the face of all of the problems that they're having, and wondering whether this thing is going to survive, and seeing the importance of it, the three of them make the heroic vow. And Blanc gives us the text. Do we want to take a look at that heroic vow? I suppose we should, since we're in the anniversary. What page is it on?
101.
101. Now, the opening paragraph is the one that's still used today. The address to the Trinity: we consecrate ourselves entirely to you. Now, why? The first paragraph is different in this first one from what we use today, of course. To procure with all our ability and efforts the establishment of the society of the Christian schools in a manner which will seem to us most agreeable to you and advantageous to this society. Notice Brother Augustine is concerned about institute, its society here at this point. Wonder if that doesn't have some reference to canonical language. Might think about
I
that.
really don't know, that's why I've asked
Yeah.
Leonard Bach to investigate.
Yeah, but he'd have to look at the canonical usage of these various terms too, because pious associations, for example, and pious societies, there were so many of those and I think the founder didn't want to have it in order, and society was too general, perhaps, as community would have been too. So maybe something to that. So for this purpose, he names himself, and he always calls himself priest. De La Salle always was clearly conscious of the fact that he was different from the brothers. Even maybe a little snooty with regard to the social gap. He couldn't abandon his own upbringing and his social status, but certainly he never abandoned his concept of being a priest. And then Vuillard and Rollin, from now on and forever, until the last surviving one of us. This is where the heroicity comes, I suppose. Or one or the other. It's something like one of those warranties that you get, for an automobile. 5,000 miles, 50,000 miles, or 3 years, whichever comes first. So from now on or forever, until the last surviving one of us, or until the complete establishment of the said society, which is another reason why it's a process, because they're not thinking of the society as established yet. We make the vow of association and union. So the vow this time is a vow of association and union to bring about maintain the establishment without being able to withdraw from this obligation, even if only we three remain, and if we're obliged to beg for alms and live on bread alone. In view of which we promise to do, all together and by common accord, everything we shall think in conscience, and regardless of any human consideration, to be for the greater good of the said society. So So that's the first vow. It's a vow to associate together to get this thing established. Now, in all of his writing, I have a thing on Blount about vows, because he's writing after the Bull of Approbation has been approved. He's thinking like a canonist and a canon lawyer and an ecclesiastic, and he's talking about religious orders and solemn vows, and he's got all those categories in his head, and he is not looking at the reality of the founders' development with the brothers. The first private vow in 1686 was a vow to obey the superior, to give stability to this enterprise. Nothing in there about becoming a religious order. And this time it's a vow of association, which is at the center of the whole thing. And it's the only thing that's here in this vow. Okay? So that's the heroic vow. All right? So, all right, now we've got at Vaugirard. Then the next thing on the agenda is the novitiate. So he gets the novitiate going. And it's very interesting what he says about the novitiate. First of all, I guess we can, in spite of what Reyes was saying, I suspect some of the descriptions of the penances and so on are a little bit exaggerated, but it was a very penitential existence, probably, that's for sure, with the novices. And the schedule was set up, which I think became the regular pattern of the schedule of the novitiates that we've had ever since. But he mentions that in spite of all of that, in spite of the freezing cold and everything else, and going to bed with frozen underwear in the winter and all those lovely details, none of them ever got sick. So it's kind of interesting. Aren't the statistics interesting on the recruits? He was getting 5 solid novices every year, pretty much on the average. Over this 6 or 7 year period, 35 persevered out of about 300 who came and went and so on and so forth. But boy, wouldn't we be happy if we had 5 novices a year. Last year we didn't have a single one in the whole United States. And next year we'll have 5 or 6 in the novitiate to cover 8 or 9 provinces. So, there you are. But And he makes the point, too, that this attracted a very large number of quality candidates. It attracted a fair number of fly-by-night people, too, of course. We've always had those in the novitiate. In the old Barrytown novitiate, I think in our group, I think something more than 50 came into the novitiate the year I entered the novitiate in 1940. There were 35 from the juniorate, and about something like 17 came in from outside, as I did. But some of those who came in from outside barely stayed overnight. Now they took one look at the place and realized this is not for me. The recruiter had been giving perhaps too much of a glowing description of the marvelous location on the banks of the Hudson River. You could spit into the river. Well, you'd have to be a pretty good spit if you wanted to make it. So this has always been the problem of the case, I guess. I have a lot of comments I could make about this, especially about the junior, but I was really distressed because I guess I really wanted to go to the junior myself. It was probably the influence of Brother Augustine in freshman year, but it was a big family, it was the Depression and so on, so the old man said, nothing doing, you've got to stay, you've got to help support this family, so I had to go to work for a couple of years. And worked in sweatshops mostly, that's where I got all of my barracks vocabulary, let's say. And after 2 years of that, people were getting married all around me, and I figured, well, boy, this is looking more and more attractive all the time. I finally said to the old man, I think I really want to be a brother, but it's either now or never, another year of this, and I don't think there's going to be much left of my interest. So, okay, just go ahead. So we go to there, after this struggle, sort of, and resistance, not only with my father, but the brothers. Good grief. In first year, the recruiter came around, and inspired by Brother Augustine and so on, write down what you want to be. So I wrote down brother. Wasn't even called in for an interview. the monks must have got the word to him, oh God, don't pay attention to that character. That's one of the reasons I made the points I made last night. That was partially autobiographical. The second year comes around, write down, brother. So this time I had an interview, and when he heard that my parents didn't understand us at all and so on, well, that the recruiter lost interest, and towards the end of the year, the homeroom teacher calls me up and he says, hey, Sam, he says, I hear you want to be a brother. Oh, he says, I hope you don't have as terrible and a discouraging year as I had this year. He started hinting to me that everything was terrible and it was a mess. I thought it was the best year of my whole life, and our class was successful and all that sort of stuff. But he didn't like the class. He left the institute shortly after John Benton. And third year, we had a real character for the homeroom teacher, thin old man, with a marvelous mathematician. His name was Austin. We used to call him Husky Austin because he was so skinny. The brothers had another name for him, Jerry Two-Bits. So Two-Bits calls me up. Hey, Sam, he says, I hear you want to go to Barrytown and be a brother. He says, ha ha, he said, you wouldn't last 2 weeks. So that's the story of my vocation. When I finally got to the novitiate, here were these 35 kids from the small, and I said to myself, wouldn't it be great finally to be with a bunch of fellows of my own age, more or less, all of whom are gung-ho to be brothers. And so we go out to recreation, and I was very enthusiastic about CBA Albany, the school I had gone to. So in the first recreation, we're out there, and we've discussed the book, as Gus said, and then somebody said, now, postulant Psalm, what do you want to have something to say? Oh, I said, I just like the idea of being a brother. I came from this wonderful school, and I started talking about some of the things that were going on at CBA. And so the monitor says, dear brother postulant, the holy rule says you will not talk about the place you have been or the place you have come from, and so on and so forth. So I was shut up very, very properly. And then the bastards all started talking about what they had been doing in the small novitiate. And then for the rest of the postulancy, they were dropping off like flies. They were all going around crying and weeping and gnashing their teeth and oh, this is terrible. And this manual labor, we can't talk. I said, you guys don't know what manual labor is. I work for 8 hours a day for 27 cents an hour, for crying out loud. To have only 2 hours and in the outdoors in the fresh air, this is great. So they thought I was strange. I'm wasting time, but anyway. So I always think lovingly of Lasallian and the success of those 35 who stayed. Interesting too. It's interesting that De La Salle seemed always to have a thing with the holy priests or priests who were interested in somehow sharing a little bit in the austerity and the type of life. Again, I think part of the spirituality of the times, huh? And so he had this priest come from Law to live with him for a while, and then he had this, and then a count, of course, the layman again, going to the Trappist every year, and then suddenly realized that he had something similar in his backyard. And then Bowen and the Sulpicians had a minor seminary nearby. That lovely story about Bowen coming with his seminarians and De La Salle with his brothers, and the two of them saying Mass and distributing communion. And then, of course, Blam makes the judgment. But of the two of them, it was clear that De La Salle did a better job. He was even more holy and more recollected than the other one. Kind of funny. And then Bowen coming there to give the founder spiritual direction and waiting outside for him and so on. So this is what leads me to think that at this point, De La Salle was no longer using Baudrin as his permanent spiritual director, but probably using Bowen. In 1693, you have that famine where he has to move them back to Paris and so on. And then that son of a gun, Baudrin, by the way, his name sometimes is spelt with a D at the end and sometimes not. Hernandez leaves off the D. I forget now whether it's in Blan's original French. You see it both ways. Same with the spellings of we are, for example. So, and although Baudrin is not very helpful to them during the famine of 1693, when they have to go back into Paris, and he's holding back the money and all that, I don't think there's anything to comment about the fact except to notice it. Is there anything about that now? About the Vaugirard thing that anybody wants to bring up? Were most of you able to get through this reading, by the way? Is that a nasty question to ask? More or less? Yes, as I said, I think, as Gus presumes you read the letters, I have to presume you're reading Blanc, and I can speed through some of this stuff and just bring out some things to highlight. And I'm perfectly willing to halt if some of you want to bring out some things to highlight. Okay, Frank?
On page 102 here, about 15 lines or so from the top, Blaine says, "For one of the two later became a new Judas."
Yeah.
Who does Blaine think he is?
Oh, well, we'll delay on that a little bit when if that's mild compared to what he ultimately says if you've read the rest of it. Huh? He's talking about Vuillard, of course.
The place is already, Vaugirard, I mean, it seems like it's like an abandoned farm.
Something like that, I guess. Apparently it had a lot of space around it. They found it was great on fresh air and all that.
No windows and,
Well, you have to, I suspect, Bland never saw it, I'm sure. Well, maybe he did, because he was in Paris in 1693, and he was in Saint-Sulpice. He might have been out there with Boeing, so he might have seen the thing.
even like, saying that you lived through the winter in that section of France, and with snow coming in and covering the blankets, I mean, it just doesn't seem possible.
Doesn't. No, and of course, we're so used to central heating and all that sort of stuff. I was amazed my first time I went to Europe, even in England, for example, where they didn't have central heating in any of the houses. And the older ones had fireplaces. The new thing was to have electric heaters in there, which you could put on if you wanted, but they piled themselves up with blankets and all that sort of stuff. But the monks in England in some of those houses, and I was there at Christmas time, the house was freezing, compared to what I was used to. And they were getting up in the morning. There was no running hot water, but taking showers, cold showers. Getting out of one of those beds in the dead of winter. So the same thing with the mother house. I think Brother Augustine, I know Charles Henry, the experience they had in the mother house in 46, 47, when there was no heat there all winter long, it was just expected that you could keep moving or wrap yourself up in a robe or, but I suspect there's a fair amount of exaggeration here too. And don't forget, it doesn't snow all winter long in those countries either.
Talk about Vaugirard. The quality of the research come to mind. In the very beginning, those who came, about 10 years before this or something like that, in Green, the first recruits, and the others were not very good quality, as it were. Now here we there's a kind of a change. So over a period of these 10 years, the kind of young men who came to join the brothers were different.
No, but
Say something along that line.
No, but if you remember back in Reims, the first group of 6 or so, most of them left. But Bland tells us that the next group that came along were of much better quality. And if you remember the story about the 3 brothers who died, young and all that sort of stuff, a couple of them were from fairly well-to-do
Well, that's
families.
what struck me too, that they were high bred and all that kind of stuff.
And when Gus gets his book out on all of those early brothers, we'll get even a better insight into this. But as we'll see here in this narrative, people like Rollin had some kind of education beforehand, Bartholomew, and so there were a fair number of that type coming in anyhow, that had some kind of. Yeah, Peter?
On page 96, I find last commentary on the priesthood question. It was like he really gave them jabs.
Yeah. I have a remark on that too. And I'm saying And this again, I think, is I've put next to it Bland's autobiography again. I mean, he's talking about his own sense of his own dignity as a priest here when he goes off on things like this. A little later on, though, he has an interesting description of a brother's vocation, and I'll try to point that out when we get to it.
You see it more as I spoke about his dignity as a priest.
Yes, I think so.
He's making pot shots at priestly time.
Yeah, oh yeah, sure, because this was one of his jobs.
Oh.
Yeah, okay, he was put in charge of a minor seminary for a while, and he had an awful time with a lot of them. And of course, the Jansenism was all over the place and so on and so forth.
Well, what was Vaudrin's basic reason for not wanting an officiate Beaujolais? Was it that he would lose control, like they were trying to get him lean over the brothers in a local area?
I'm sorry, I lost the first part.
You know, Vaudrin, is that the person that he
Yeah.
did not want an officiate at Beaujolais?
Yeah, right. He didn't want an novitiate at all.
Why?
Well, that's why he tries to suggest that this would be the foundation of an independent group over which he as pastor would have no control. The beginning almost of an order that would transcend the parish and the diocese and everything. And I think Baudrin's plan in his own mind was fine. We got this terrific group with this leader who has a lot of sense and holds them together and so on. And now this is just going to become a permanent feature of the parish of Saint-Sulpice.
That's the same thing like L'Atelier.
Same exact thing as L'Atelier, exactly. And we'll see towards the end that when the founder is down in the south, they actually try to rewrite the rule in such wise that everything else will be closed except the parish of Saint-Sulpice. That the institute would become a parochial institute. All right. Now let's take a look then at the famous chapter of 1694. I think I mentioned one time earlier in the beginning when this stuff wasn't so fresh in my mind, that the first general chapter is considered to be 1617. That's not 1717. That's not correct. In the official list, this is considered the first general chapter, 1694. The first, and we count from there. I wonder why I've often wondered why they never counted 1686. It may have been that when they started the count, and I don't know when they began numbering them, they skipped the other one because there was no change in the superior, no election of a superior. But there was, of course, but it didn't last. But this time they formally elected De La Salle to be their superior. And also it may be that that this is the first time they made perpetual vows. So some of those reasons may have led them not to take the 1686 one quite so seriously, although I think it would deserve to do so. But at any rate, so 1694 is this general chapter. The first item on the agenda is the rules. And so we know that there was already a list of regulations that had been a kind of daily coutumier, a reglement that had been circulated and so on. The first text of the rule that we have that has survived, the manuscript, is 1705, 10 years later than this. But that probably reflects pretty much the rule that was put together here in 1694. And the rule emerged out of the experience of the brothers. And with consultation with the founder certainly exercising a leadership role. There are ways of leading people to think that they're more involved than they actually are. But that's one side of it. But there's no question that the other side was based on their experience, and the founder certainly adjusted his own thinking to what they thought of their experience and putting in things they thought should be there and taking out things that should not. So out of this we get the first common rule of the Institute. And so this was the first thing that had to be approved. Gus, you look like you wanted to say something about that, did you? Now, as we'll see, these are subject to revision again, and a couple of very significant revisions in 1717. I'm writing a book about the last three general chapters. And the next thing that I finished writing up the chapter of 1966-67, and I have a long section there about the genesis of the new rule that was put together in 1966. 67 in that chapter, that 39th general chapter. And the next thing that I have to address in this history is why we left that chapter full of excitement and elation and everything else, and thereafter the whole thing began to fall apart. And the question of why, what happened after 67? And why didn't the new rule, the rule which is new at that time, which is the basis of the rule we have at the present time, why didn't that grab hold of the brothers? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I've been asking myself whether or not the rule we now have was as based on the experience of the brothers as the original rule of the founder. And the problem, of course, was that by the time we got to 1966, this rule of 1705 and 1717, the rule, talk about the manuscripts, but if you want, the rule of 1694, which then was revised somewhat in 1717, that rule came out of the experience of the brothers. This reflected their lived experience. By the time we got to 1947, with the same text, it was completely at odds with the experience of the brothers. And so in creating a whole new thing, I think the new rule really came out of the Declaration. Now, to what extent did that come out of the experience of the brothers? It did, in a way, as represented by the general chapter. But the rule that finally came out, and for 10 years previously, that had been sent all around the Institute to the visitors and their councils to respond, to try to create a new rule using somewhat the same process that the founder did. But then when we got to the general chapter, that proved to be so built into the mentality prior to Vatican II. All of a sudden with Vatican II, we have a new climate and a new lived experience and everything new floating around all over the place. And to try so quickly to encapsulate that into a text may be some of the problems. So I haven't resolved that in my own mind. Did the 67 rule reflect the 1717 rule certainly did not reflect the lived experience of the brothers anymore. And did the 67 rule reflect the experience of the brothers? And to what extent did it? It's an interesting question.
In addition to those considerations, which I think are very good, would you not also have to factor into that all of what else was going on in everybody's life at that time?
Yes, of
I
course.
think that had a lot of...
Yeah, that's a very good point too, because, for example, the novices in Barrytown were told, another brother and myself as delegates to the chapter, before we went to the novitiate, the director of novices told them that it was a waste of money to send anybody to Rome for the general chapter because the Institute no longer had anything to say to the brothers. And after the thing was over, we went to the Scholastic in Washington, practically got laughed out of the hall trying to say something positive about what it is. So that was rampant and pervasive. Gus?
Yeah. One of the aspects of contemporary thought was the rejection of institutions.
Yeah.
And in a sense, among the young, rejection of authority. The only authority is, I remember talking to Scholastic and Efficient and just for the discussion, saying to him, well, you want to be following the truth, don't you? He said, yes, brother director, but it's the truth as I see it.
Yeah. Well, it's but it's an interesting thing. Again, how much of this 17th century experience is translatable and transportable into our own situation. One more, Steve, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I think the rule of 67, at least compared to the rule of 47, certainly reflects experience of brothers, but there's a factor in there that didn't have to be contended with you much earlier, and that was diversity of various cultures and the experience of the spirituality and everything among different cultures. By the time the rule of 67 got approved in 86 or whatever the year that was, last chapter, there are shades of it perhaps that in various cultures that we might not consider our experience, but I think in general it seems to me that it certainly reflects the declarations, which certainly reflected the experience of brothers, particularly in the United States and Canada and someplace where
France, sir?
factors.
Yeah, well, it's something interesting to think about. And maybe
May
you
I
could
ask
say,
one question?
yes.
How many of the brothers in this room read the rule every day? Raise your hand.
We read as a community, as part of the person.
I'm thinking of your own personal concern about the rule as the principal interpretation of the gospel for you and your vocation. I think we're not inclined to that kind of life. Being guided by.
But that's an extreme example. You know, I had a lot to do with that rule, and I don't read it every day either. I know it by heart. But don't you think the brothers are discovering that rule that we have?
I hope so. But I mean,
It's used a lot in prayer services,
I
and
think that if it is what it's supposed to be, we'd be reading it, not every day, very frequently, and meditating on it. And we're not doing it.
oh, well, I think that is that. I think people are reading it and meditating on it, but not every day, and not always personally.
I said every day.
But if there's another way to be concerned about the rule in our life, other than reading it every day, I think that most people I don't know.
How many think the text of the rule has something to say to the brothers today? Yeah, and how many contact it from time to time? Let's ask that question. You get a slightly different thing. Peter, let's go to coffee and